Today's first scripture reading is the story of Hagar from the book of Genesis. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar, and Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "You have now conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all his kin." So she named the Lord who spoke to her. "You are Elroy," she said, "for I have really seen God and remained alive after seeing him." Therefore, the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael.
So today we begin a whole new series, a series called Nevertheless She Persisted. Anybody heard that one recently? I thought it was a good slogan to talk about women's voices in the Bible, because there's a lot of persistence in the Bible. There's a lot of resistance in the Bible, and persistence is needed throughout all that resistance. For voices to be heard in the Bible, sometimes they have to be reiterated over and over and over again. And often we hear these voices over and over again from the Hebrew Bible even into the New Testament. And it goes around and around and around, and all those voices that we hear then are exactly the same voices of what we're going to need to be hearing today. In fact, some of those voices are, in fact, reiterated in our voices of today. So the more we study these voices from the Bible, the more we'll recognize them when we hear them in our own context, and be able to be listening to that old conversation as well as our new conversations. We chose 6 different women from the Bible to help us with talking about these women's voices in the Bible. Now, the first one is today from Sara and Hagar, or Hagar is the Hebrew word for that. And the rabbi has assured me that you can pronounce it either way and still be correct. So no worries about that. You don't have to worry about any pronunciations in the Bible. Just say it really boldly and everybody will believe it, right? Okay. So Sarah and Hagar, or Hagar, is going to be our story today, and we have lots of things to talk about there. But Esther is also a great story that we've talked about here before. From the Judaic tradition, there are all kinds of wonderful women's voices that are being raised. And Esther started out as being an orphan, and then was adopted by an uncle and brought up in a whole different life than what she had originally started in, and then actually became queen of Susa and didn't know what to do with any of that, and then found her particular calling at a particular time. So that's an amazing story of Esther. If you haven't heard that one, that's a good one to hear as well. Ruth and Naomi are a couple of women. There's a third woman that's a part of that group. It's a mother and two daughter-in-laws, and their story of losing both sons and husbands so that they end up being widows together. And they have lost all their attachments to their society that the men provided for them. And so they have to make it on their own together. And they have to decide whether they're going to stay together or separate and go back into their own homes. And the story of Ruth and Naomi specifically has wonderful voice about faithfulness in relationship. So that's why we chose them. The Samaritan woman at the well, we don't even know her name, right? There are women in the Bible that are so well named, and you hear about them all the time. And then there are women at the Bible that they don't even have names, right? They just say there's a woman there. But the story that surrounds her is amazing. She's the one person that meets Jesus and constantly resists what he's trying to say and saying, you're stepping outside of the bounds all over the place here. What gives you the right to do that? Who are you to do what you do? So challenging Jesus is a voice from a woman that really has absolutely nothing to lose meeting Jesus. And that voice is certainly that voice of persistence and resistance. The Syrophoenician woman is the woman who dares to reach out to Jesus just to touch his robe in order to be healed from her affliction that she's been struggling with for years. And she honestly believes that this man has something going on that can help her. And that faithfulness and that persistence and that daringness to reach out and touch Jesus no matter the consequences is a voice that's strong and should be heard. And Mary Magdalene, a fabulous voice in the New Testament, right? We don't even really know exactly where she came from or how she got where she is. And yet, there's very even little written about her, but she ends up everywhere. She's always all over the place. And she is considered to be one of Jesus' very first disciples. In fact, is the one who sees Jesus first after the resurrection, right? So what a fabulous voice to be hearing from these women. They tell us much about the rich culture of the time. They tell us much about their roles because they had roles and they had voices. They just weren't as strong as what they could be, but that doesn't mean they didn't have control over what was happening, right? A lot of times they did. So those voices of persistence need to be heard, I think, even today. And more importantly, what we're listening for when we listen to these women's voices is who God is in their eyes and how does God work in the world. Every story of the Bible, no matter whether it's a women's story or a man's story or any story in the Bible, foreign, refugee, whatever, the whole point of the biblical stories is to point us toward who God is, right? So we have two questions that we're constantly asking. What is God doing in the world, and how do we participate in that? And the Bible helps us see how that's been happening throughout history and how God is a God of our history and is actively participating with us in our living with one another. So those are the voices that we're listening to, and a variety and diversity of voices give us a fuller view of how God works in the world. So that's why we're intentionally listening to the women's voices in this series, just to broaden our perspective about how people view God and how they see God working in the world. That might give us some new insights about how we see God in the world. Today, our story is Sara and Hagar. Now, these women have had struggles throughout. They don't like each other. They've failed miserably to trust God, so they try to take things into their own hands and make things right. And then Abraham, who's supposed to be leading the whole pack, has no faith in God either and is constantly hiding behind these women, right, to get to where Abraham needs to go. And you'll hear more and more about the story as we go. But this particular story is a story of persistence, not only within their own struggles to try to get through, but in the struggle for listening for God's voice in the midst of their conversation. Because just when they know they're on the right track and they're getting there, they forget that God's a part of that. and they start taking things into their own hands, and things get really bad really fast. And then all of a sudden, God's voice comes back into the conversation and helps pull them back to that center. And that's what these stories are trying to tell us, that it's not about what we do, but in the struggle, God's voice is with us. And it's about God loving us that gets us through. That persistent, steadfast love of God is what carries us through every one of these stories. So that's what we're listening for today when we talk about Sara and Hagar and Abraham. They all mess up. They're imperfect people. The oppressed become the oppressors. It's devastating in some respects. And yet God manages to do impossible things with improbable people. And so it's an amazing story that we should hear. Beyond these stories from the Bible, we're also going to be spending some time during this series listening to current women's voices. There is a thing on Facebook called Cup of Jane. Joni Stacy was the one that introduced me to that. And it's a fabulous women's history series that was started for Women's History Month. And they have about 150 different voices out there of current women's voices doing great things throughout history. And so while we're listening to biblical voices, I also would like to introduce some of the most current voices of women. This is the first one of that series.
And now let us listen to the story of Sara. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sara and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, and knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sara?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sara shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh."
We at worship team, come on up. We at worship team had a discussion about the story of Sarah and Abraham and Hagar, and we were trying to figure out, okay, we have this great man of biblical history that's supposedly so great at trusting God, right? Has this ultimate faith. And all of us strive to be as great as Abraham in our faith. And what we find when we actually read those stories is that really Abraham messed up over and over and over again. Faith was the very least thing that he had, actually, throughout this whole thing. And so we were trying to figure out if Abraham is considered the founding prophet of the three Abrahamic faiths that we have based this tri-faith thing on, right? Islam, Israel, or Judaism, and by extension Christianity, then his faith matters, right? But where were Sara and Hagar in this? Did they have a voice? And how did that voice get heard? And then we got to thinking that maybe Sara and Hagar had maybe a bigger role in it than Abraham. So why is it the Abrahamic faiths and not the Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham faiths? And then we got to wondering, wouldn't that be funny if we were to challenge that in today's society? Would Abraham actually withstand a confirmation hearing as the father of our faiths, right? On Father's Day, that's a good question to ask, right? But what about the founding prophet thing? Where do the women fit into that story? So we created a confirmation hearing for Abraham. Here we go. We welcome all of you to this confirmation hearing of Abraham, the one who is known as the founding prophet of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. The purpose of this hearing is to determine if Abraham is properly suited for this calling. Our first examiner will be Hagar, the Egyptian handmaid to Abraham's wife Sara and mother to the son Ishmael, from whom the entire Islam faith tradition rests. Hagar.
I never wanted to be a mother. As a slave, I was never really given the choice. Sarah and Abraham, my master, had yet to bear children in their many years of marriage. One day, my mistress directed me to be as wife to Abraham, and so I did. That night, my master planted a child within me, and I was filled with contempt, and so were they. So I left. At a spring where I rested on my way to Shur, I met Elroy, an angel of the Lord. He told me to return to my mistress and to submit. But, and you may not believe this, he also told me I was to have many children, so many that they could not be counted. He told me that I was to bear a son whose life would not be easy, but he said, the Lord has heard me, and so I should call him Ishmael, which means the Lord hears. So I went back.
Thank you for starting this process for us. There are many stories that surround Abraham's history, and it's good to hear your voice. Thank you. And now let us turn the floor to our senior member of our committee, Sara, Abraham's wife and mother of Isaac.
Senior member of our committee. I was a young woman when Abe took me as his wife. We moved around a lot throughout our life together. One year there was a famine where we were staying, so we moved to Egypt. On our way there, Abe asked me to tell the Egyptians that I was his sister, because if I was introduced as his wife, they might kill him. Oh, it seemed like a good plan at the time, until Pharaoh took me into his house. After that, Pharaoh was afflicted with a great many plagues. One night he asked me, "What's going on, really?" So I told him that I was Abe's wife. The Pharaoh panicked. He went straight to Abe and told him to take his wife and all his belongings and get out of Egypt. We left as quickly as we could, and eventually we settled in Canaan near the oaks at Mamre. It was here where I realized that I might never be able to bear children with Abe, and came up with a brilliant idea. I would give my husband a wife of my choosing. This wife would need to be capable of bearing a child, not too good looking, and needed to follow orders as directed. I settled on Hagar. I told Abe to have our child through Hagar. My plan worked. Our child was conceived, but Hagar disrespected me from that point on. So I told Abe he and his God needed to keep her in her place. She is a handmaid. When I went to talk to Hagar, she had run away. I thought my problem had solved itself, but then she came back.
Well, there are some emotions that surround these stories, yes. But let's try to stick to the facts, ladies, shall we? And thank you, Sara. The chair has, in your conversation, received a special request. So the floor now is open for the Lord of all creation.
Thank you. I would like to offer a story about Abraham that may pertain to this proceeding. I trust Abraham. One day, we were wandering in the desert and came upon Abraham's tent near Mamre. When he saw us, Abraham ran to meet us and bowed before us, though he had never met us and had no idea who we were. He brought us water for our feet and offered the shade of his tree for our rest. He asked his wife to make us some bread and ordered his servant to prepare us a tender calf for our meal. He stood beside us under the tree while we ate. He welcomed us strangers into his house and was the consummate host, even though he had only recently been circumcised and was still resting in recovery. We asked him where his wife Sara was, to make sure she was in hearing distance of what we were about to say to Abraham. We conveyed that we would return to Abraham in due season, and that by then Sara would have a son. Because Sara did, in fact, hear our pronouncement, she laughed, thinking we could not hear her. But we did. We asked Abraham why Sara would doubt that she would bear a child in her advanced age. Does Sara doubt that anything is too wonderful for the Lord? Sara was the one who denied her doubt and laughter, not Abraham. And we said, "Oh yes, you did laugh."
Madam Chair, as much as I appreciate and am grateful for the Lord of all creation's trust in my husband, I would like to offer further evidence as to Abraham's incapacity to be the founding prophet of our faiths from my own experience.
Well, it sounds like there's stories from all sides, but please continue. The chair recognizes our senior member, Sara, wife of Abraham.
My husband never seems to learn from his mistakes. Shortly after this promise, a son to Abraham at Mamre, we settled in Gerar, a place between Kadesh and Shur. Because we were aliens in this land, Abe was yet again afraid of their king, Abimelech, and chose to introduce me as his sister, just like he had in Egypt. And you, Lord of all creation, had to step in yet again to correct the mistake. Abimelech had a dream telling him that I was Abraham's wife before he took me as his own. Granted, we were vindicated, and you restored the land of Gerar to its full abundance once the king presented us with silver and invited us to settle wherever we chose. But tell me, how is this man who continues to cower before kings fit to be the founding prophet of our faiths? Even after our son Isaac was born, Abraham did not take a stand between our child Isaac, the one promised and delivered by the Lord God of all creation, and the son born to him by an Egyptian handmaid. I tried keeping the children apart since her child had become such a handful, undisciplined, and could never seem to get along with anyone. Was the whole of the nation's promise to Abraham to put at risk because of this bad influence on our child? It wasn't until I put my foot down and demanded that Abraham send this handmaid and her child away did Abraham even consider the negative influence this boy was having on our son. And it wasn't until you, the Lord of all creation, told Abraham to not be distressed about the boy and his mother because you would take care of them that he finally did as I asked for the sake of his own true son.
Madam Chair, though I have my own struggles with this woman who dares to call my son a bad influence on her son when it was all her idea in the first place to conceive, I too would like to reiterate my question of Abraham's fitness as a founding prophet.
Well, there seem to be some high emotions here, and I will allow this as long as we stick to Abraham's fitness. It looks like you all have your own struggles, but let's concentrate on Abraham. The chair recognizes our junior committee member, Hagar, mother of Ishmael.
In truth, neither of my masters seems to learn from their mistakes. Once again, when my son was seen to show affection for the newborn Isaac, he and I were sent away from the family. And although you, Lord of all creation, told Abraham not to be distressed because my son would also make a great nation, he did nothing to stop his wife from exiling us. He made sure we had bread and water, but that did not last very long. My son and I were left to die, and I was forced to lay him beneath a bush and sit in far view of him so that I would not have to watch. Even though Elroy, and now I'm beginning to realize that Elroy must be you, Lord of all creation. You heard my son's cry, then provided a well of water for us to drink. We still were exiled from the family, and we were forced to live in the wilderness of Paran for the rest of our days. So, again, I ask, how is this man, Abraham, fit to be the founding prophet of our faith?
My daughters, I understand your concerns. I have heard your cries. But please, do not forget that what makes Abraham a founding prophet is my love for him. Abraham does not need to fit a list of requirements to be my child. I created him. I chose him. He is my child. The love I have for Abraham is the same love I have for all my children, which makes you, Sara, and you, Hagar, founding prophets of these faiths as well.
Well, that certainly changes our conversation, does it not?
To an extent.
So there is no list to be considered here. So because Abram was created as God's child, as are you and you. Let the people say, Amen.